Hi, I'm Larry Castle here with Ken Brown for episode 75 of That's a Good Question. What can Christians learn from the politics of 2021? Our year in review, part 2. Welcome to our last episode of 2021. It's our final episode. We said we were going to take a couple of episodes at the end of the year and kind of do a year in review. So we'll be taking the next 2 weeks off after this for Christmas and New Year, since they fall on Saturdays. That's the day we normally publish the podcast. So today we're going to finish off 2021. And in last week's episode, we talked about the first part of our year in review, which was kind of political, cultural issues, and we said we'd take another episode and talk about more of the doctrinal religious. Well, in this past week, we had some news break, and so we wanted to make sure we addressed that as well. It relates to these issues we've been talking about. So we're going to pick up part 2 of the political side of that. What can Christians learn from the politics of 2021? We'll do that this week, and then first episode of next year, we'll delve into the doctrinal and religious aspects. So we're asking that same question as last week because of the news that broke, and we should comment on that, we said. And I want to preface my introduction of this topic by saying that for many years, as a young conservative, my friends can attest to this, I bemoaned the warping of the news, the slanted narratives that I saw coming from the liberal-leaning media. These sources that obviously had a bias, weren't admitting to it. And the way I describe the topic we're about to discuss then is in keeping with the principles that drove me to criticize those liberal-leaning outlets. And so it doesn't matter whether the source doing the truth twisting is from my side of the aisle or not. So
that's
the breaking news.
It shouldn't matter.
Yeah, exactly. As we've said over and over again, we should be people of truth.
Right.
So we were reminded, I should say, last week that 2021 started with an insurrection at our nation's capital. The congressional committee that's looking into the planning and execution of that riot is doing so in hopes of holding to account those who are responsible and ensuring that this kind of thing doesn't happen again. The committee released some information related to both the riot, but also another subject about which we have talked at length, and that is the right-wing media machine. So there's why I gave the preface. I just used the phrase right-wing media machine, and I say that advisedly. This group distributes disinformation to many of our listeners, and so that's why we care about it.
And we're not saying that there isn't a left-wing media
absolutely.
machine. Right.
Absolutely.
It's
People who listen to those outlets aren't generally watching our podcast because they're not our people.
That's just, please understand that point. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So why don't you talk about what happened and how those two things, the riot and the media disinformation, are related?
So the House Select Committee that's investigating the January 6th riot and attempted insurrection has issued dozens of subpoenas for documents and testimony. Some of those have been rebuffed so that the individual subpoenaed to appear and or to produce documentation has refused to do so. Now, many of those who have refused have done so based on a dubious claim called executive privilege. I can't talk to you or I can't produce documents to you that are about any discussions I had with the executive, the chief executive, namely the president, because discussions with the president are privileged when he invokes the privilege.
Okay, so there's a thing called executive privilege, so that those who are close to a president and give him advice don't have to disclose what they talked about, even if there's a concern that it may be relevant to investigating criminal activity. Why is that privileged?
Well, presidents are, and I think understandably, given wide latitude in invoking executive privilege and telling their subordinates not to talk about to anyone about their discussions. It's been this way going back, in fact, to our very first president, George Washington. He told his military personnel not to talk to Congress about a failed military operation because it involved secrets that should not be made public, military secrets that should not be made public. Now, you can see that that would be valuable to any administration as long as because it allows advisors then to speak freely, candidly, without worrying that their advice is going to be splashed all over the internet, and it also protects certain secrets that are of interest to the entire nation. Now, if that's all executive privilege did, protect necessary secrets, allow presidents to receive open advice, then there would be little controversy about it. And for most of our nation's history, really, there has not been. It becomes controversial when a president uses it for his benefit rather than the country's. Now, who would be of such character that they would do that, okay? And unfortunately, in our lifetime, we have had at least a couple of presidents who are of such character. Nixon did it with the Watergate tapes. Now, interestingly, he did not invoke executive privilege for testimony of his aides. So he said, the Congress is subpoenaing you for testimony, live testimony before the whole nation and the world. Go give it. And that led then to the Watergate tapes. Because as I said, as I was talking to you about this, there was a guy, a little known guy that worked in the White House named Alexander Butterfield. And he was called to give testimony. And during his testimony, he mentioned that there's this taping system. And, you might ask, well, why would there be a taping system?
That's
why
what
would
I was just going to say. And
Yeah.
why would you say some of the things that were said if you
Yes.
knew there's a taping system?
But it's my understanding that that taping system in the Oval Office was installed by Lyndon Johnson, the president just before Nixon. So it was already there. Nixon knew it was there, but he had been using it for years. And I also understand that it was voice activated. So it wasn't like he hit a button.
They had Amazon Alexa.
Okay. And so he just starts talking. He's got a record. Sometimes that's good to be able to go back to.
Okay.
And he just wasn't, he was just not thinking about it. It was just, he had his conversations. So Alexander Butterfield reveals the existence of this thing, though. The Congress did not know there was such a thing. So Nixon allowed his people to go. He didn't invoke executive privilege on their testimony, but now there's the tapes. Now, others since him have invoked it, but not usually to protect themselves. But Trump has told his associates not to cooperate with the January 6th Commission.
And he's not even president now. So how does he order people, testify, don't testify?
Well, the truth is just about everything that we have seen, and that's an exaggeration, so that's why I say that just about everything. But much of what we have seen with the former president is unprecedented. And here's yet another example. I mean, Nixon's people went to jail, and yet he pardoned none of them. Now, if he had handled Watergate the way Trump has handled his own scandals, like the Russia Mueller investigation. If Nixon had handled this that way, this is what he would have done. He would have dangled pardons in front of his aides, told them to plead the fifth, or invoke executive privilege, or both, try to play out the clock until the end of his presidency, because those things get tied up in court and all of that. And then ultimately, if they are convicted and they're going to go to jail, then he just pardons them, and they end up not going to jail. And the president has that pardon power. He pardoned none of them.
This is pure conjecture, but do you have any guesses why he wouldn't have done that back then? Because that wouldn't fly back then?
It wouldn't fly, but, it wouldn't fly politically, okay, back then. Most definitely, it would not have flown politically, and that was certainly a major constraint. And then I just have to think, and it's a guess, it wouldn't fly politically, but also, we all are in a milieu. We're all in a particular environment in which that shapes our thinking. And as I say, nobody had used executive privilege for their own benefit. It just wasn't done. And there was a long and I think honorable tradition of the Congress having its own sphere of authority, and when they issue a subpoena, that's legally binding, and that you honor that subpoena and you go and you talk to it. So even Nixon, with all of his character issues, still had enough of that, shaping him. But we've come a long way, baby, since then, okay? And it's become such combat politically that all bets are off in terms of what methods you use to win. Winning is these days is all that matters. Okay. So Trump, unlike Nixon, dangled pardons to his aides so that they would not tell what they knew in the Mueller Russia probe. They did not cooperate, and in fact, he pardoned them. Mm-hmm. So here's the founders, who were, by all accounts, and we've all got to be thankful for God's providence in bringing these men of that caliber together to produce our founding documents, to establish our country. But they did not contemplate a president using his powers for his own personal protection. Mm-hmm. And they thought, you could get a rogue president. I mean, they knew it was possible. But the only remedy they gave for one who did that was impeachment, which Trump managed to achieve twice.
Overachiever.
But he was not removed because it's such a high bar, and it should be, to remove a president. You have to have 2/3 of the Senate vote to convict and remove a president from office. We've never done that. We've never removed a president from office. We've impeached Trump twice. Clinton was impeached. Andrew Johnson was impeached. We've had 4 impeachments for 3 presidents. Even Nixon was not impeached because he resigned.
Most of us probably think Nixon was impeached.
Right, but he resigned just before he was most definitely going to be. But none of them were actually removed from office. Trump, is no longer president, but is claiming a privilege, unprecedented, really, that belongs only to presidents. Now, when January 6th occurred, on January 6th, he was still president. He was lame duck. We were in the transition. So he does have that going for him, because here's this 1/6 commission asking about discussions that are just before 1/6 and just after 1/6, and he's president. But in order for an executive privilege claim to be valid, it has to be made for communications, yes, while you're president, but also for communications with your government advisors. Mm-hmm. Trump has actually claimed it for people like a guy named Steve Bannon. Now, Bannon's a guy who helped plan the events of January 6th. And the day before, Bannon has a podcast, and he virtually predicted what was going to happen the next day. So you can see why he doesn't want to testify. Mm-hmm. But Bannon was not even in government in January. And yet, Trump is claiming executive privilege for him.
Yeah, and so you're saying he did not testify before the commission.
And says, I don't need to testify because the president is invoking executive privilege. I can't tell you what I talked to the president about. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So he didn't testify, right?
And so that then is something that could get him in hot water, right?
And he is. He has been found in contempt of Congress, which now has been referred to the Justice Department for prosecution.
Which could drag on for months, if not years.
And that's the whole game, okay? That's the whole idea, to delay. And then in November of next year, you're probably going to have a majority Republican Congress that can terminate this select committee in the House altogether, just terminate the thing. If you get a majority Republican House of Representatives in November of next year, and they take office in January of 23, then they can immediately terminate the whole committee. So if you can run out the clock, then that's a strategy. So the committee now that exists right now knows that, and they're really racing against the clock.
Gotcha. And so then how was this executive privilege in the news this week?
Well, one of the people that the committee subpoenaed for documents and for testimony is Trump's former chief of staff, a guy named Mark Meadows. Now, unlike Bannon, he actually worked for the president at the time of the 1/6 insurrection. Okay. And so his discussions with the president could be privileged. That actually needs to be adjudicated, but they could be. But Meadows, though, even though he said, I'm not going to testify, he initially had started to cooperate and then backed off of that cooperation. And when he was initially cooperating, he turned over a boatload of documents to the committee.
Okay.
And I'll talk about those documents in a minute, but as of this week, now he has claimed executive privilege. He's not going to testify, and he's been held in contempt as well. And that's being referred to the Justice Department. Gotcha. But those documents that he turned over have some interesting things in them, some of which the committee made public. So this is how it became an issue this week, including text messages to Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, text messages to him from Now wait for it. Fox News hosts.
Oh my. Okay.
Fox News personalities. So this is where the media machine now
Gotcha.
comes in.
There's the connection.
And this is where I want to warn our audience yet again to be very, very, very careful where you get your so-called news. If you only get your news from conservative right-wing outlets, you get not only a slanted view, but in the case of Fox News, virtually a mouthpiece for the Trump administration when it was in office, and actually forget when it was in office, really to this
Even
day,
still,
are
yeah.
still defending and deflecting. 2 weeks ago, two longtime and very conservative and very sharp commentators on Fox resigned because they could no longer be party to the kind of whitewashing of what happened on January 6th and other things related to Trump. So they resigned from Fox News. And then a week ago Sunday, the one of maybe two truly neutral guys on Fox. Now, the other one, Brett Baer, who's on in the evening at 6 o'clock. And he does his best to be as neutral as he can, fair and balanced, okay? But Chris Wallace is the guy that Fox people will always point to when they're criticized as being slanted and pro-Trump and, kind of a propaganda machine for Trump. They say, oh, look at Chris Wallace, okay? Well, guess what? You don't have Chris Wallace anymore to cite because he abruptly resigned without explanation. And then, lo and behold, guess what? This comes out about these Fox News hosts. Now, it's just speculation. He has not said exactly why he resigned, but my guess is he knew this was coming. And that was just, okay, that's enough. We've got our people texting the chief of staff during the 1/6 insurrection. So that news this week that I'm going to talk about may explain why he resigned.
Okay.
He may have gotten word that the January 6th committee had obtained text messages from these three Fox News personalities. Brian Kilmeade, he's on in the morning. I don't know what that's called. I never watch it. And then in the evening, you've got a lineup that, oh my, Tucker Carlson, yikes. And then at 9, you've got Sean Hannity. And at 10, you've got Laura Ingraham. Well, Hannity and Ingraham, they, along with Kilmeade, separately, they all have the chief of staff's cell phone number.
Okay.
And they're all, now lots of people in Washington
Yeah.
do, lots of reporters do and all that, but they do, and they're texting him. And he turned over these texts to the committee.
Okay.
And they are begging him to ask the president to do something about this. Here's Kilmeade. Here's what Kilmeade said. Please get him, Trump, on TV. This is destroying everything you have accomplished.
Wow.
Here's Hannity writing to Mark Meadows. Can he make a statement? Can he ask people to leave the Capitol? And then here's Ingram.
I was just saying, these are good things.
They are
that
good
they're
things.
asking.
It is good. They are good. Here, we'll show where it goes south.
Okay.
I mean, if all you're trying to do is to get somebody to cease something that is bad, then that's a great thing, right? But we'll see that that's not all that's going on here. Ingram says, hey, Mark, the president needs to tell people in the Capitol to go home. This is hurting all of us. He is destroying his legacy. So as you say, that would be
So
a
yeah,
thing.
so then as you mentioned Ingram, I think immediately after the insurrection, these folks begin to talk about the idea that, hey, we don't know if these were MAGA supporters, right? Maybe this was Antifa.
Okay. And that's where it gets so depressingly ugly. You have these people sending these texts, and they can, and they already have. They've justified this. All we were doing was trying to say, hey, people might get hurt, and people are getting hurt, so stop letting people get hurt. If that's all they were doing, that would be fine. But that's not all they did. They were texting the president to call off these people. Why? Because they knew they were the president's people.
His people, yeah.
They were MAGA people. They weren't Antifa. Antifa hates Trump, and Trump hates Antifa. But this rumor that these were Antifa people inciting this first started to circulate right after the insurrection. And we said that if this was Antifa, we did way back in January, if this was Antifa attacking the Capitol, then apparently Trump did not get the memo.
Right.
Because remember, when he finally does do what these Fox News folks are begging him to do and make a statement and say, okay, go home, he also adds, we love you. And
Right.
you're very special to us. Now, viewers, if we can't agree on anything else, can we at least agree on this? That's not his language for Antifa.
Okay,
We
agreed.
love you. No.
Agreed.
And you're very special to us. He knew who they were. And the Fox News people knew who they were.
Right.
And yet that very night, they go on television and talk Antifa.
Right.
Laura Ingraham starts talking Antifa. That very day, she's begging the president to get his people out of the Capitol, and yet she's deflecting.
Deflecting heat for the
Exactly.
president.
Exactly. So they knew they were his people, which is obvious to anyone not blinded by extreme political bias or who had the cover of what they thought was privacy in these in sending these text messages. So when Kilmeade and Hannity and Ingram text former President Trump's chief of staff to ask him to call off the rioters, there were three important things about that. One, it's an acknowledgement that they were indeed MAGAs. Secondly, it's damning in that people had to ask a president to do this to begin with. Why does anyone have to ask the President of the United States to intervene when our Capitol is being overrun?
Yeah.
That's a dereliction of his constitutional
All of us
duty.
watching knew what needed to be done.
Immediately.
Yeah.
And we're crying for it. And in my case, almost literally crying. I mean, I'm choked up. I'm getting emotional watching this happen, as I know many, many other Americans did. That's a dereliction of the constitutional duty, which, by the way, the committee has hinted pretty strongly that they are looking at a refusal to carry out his oath of office by his inaction on this. And so we will see where the former president comes out in this investigation that they're doing. But they have hinted publicly that they are looking at that unwillingness to step in and do something. Because meanwhile, at least one person got killed. Many people were injured. All kinds of property, to say, use this carefully, sacred, not obviously religiously sacred, but politically sacred, property was broken. So it's a dereliction of his constitutional duty. That's something that this January 6th committee is looking at very closely. Did the president betray his oath to defend our country, including to defend our seat of government? It was 187 minutes before Trump was convinced to call off, over 3 hours.
That's really unbelievable.
It's an unforgivable, and I don't know how anybody can justify it. But here's the third thing about the Fox News host texts to Mark Meadows, the president's chief of staff. That night, as I said, Ingram goes on that very night, and she wants to talk about the riot, but she wants to relate it to Antifa. She knew it was not Antifa, but she deflects her audience away from the president and his people, and she tells Fox News viewers what they want to hear. It wasn't us. It was those people. All the while knowing she had asked the president to call it off because she knew it was not Antifa. That's called, let's get it being the truth, okay? And let's just call these things what they are. That is just out and out lying. And you cannot trust these people, and you should not.
Yeah. Now, you said something about the Trump people wanting to run out the clock in court until the next election in November of the next year, so that the newly elected Republican House of Representatives can dissolve the committee.
Right.
Is there anything that can be done to keep that from happening?
Well, as I said, that's why the committee's moving as fast as it can, because they know that that is a real possibility. So one thing that can hopefully be done is that the committee is able to get to the bottom of what happened and who planned it, hold them accountable by next summer. That's what they're trying to do. And it's possible. We'll see. But if the delay tactics work and they're not able to get finished by the summer, and now we're fully into election mode, between the summer and November of next year, then in fact you wind up, as most of us think you will, have a new House of Representatives that is Republican dominated, then Biden, though, will still be president. So even though you'll have, in all likelihood, a Republican House of Representatives, maybe even a Republican Senate, the president is still going to be Biden for 2 more years after November. And his attorney general will still be the attorney general for 2 years, Merrick Garland.
Okay.
The attorney general leads the Justice Department. So my hope is that if the committee cannot finish, then the attorney general, Garland, will appoint a special prosecutor to continue their work. And the House can do nothing about that because that special prosecutor is not under their authority. It's under the authority of the executive branch. It's under the authority of the Justice Department. So one way or the other, despite all the delays and pleading the fifth and claims of executive privilege, I think we will know who was communicating with the president and his people about what was planned for January 6th.
All right. So I remind our listeners yet again why we as two pastors care about this stuff.
Right.
And we say this, we've said it many times now, that we have a vested interest in, first of all, truth, like we've said earlier.
Right.
And it's important that we be consistent in how we apply that principle of wanting to find the truth and promote the truth. But we have a vested interest in an orderly government.
Yes.
So institutions, that means institutions that are stable, carrying out their work based on the rule of law. And when that is undermined, it creates an unpredictable environment. And that's what the Apostle Paul was talking about, that we shouldn't want as Christians.
Right.
You know, as we said last week, Paul said that we should pray for those in authority, that they're able to do their work in a way that allows us to lead what he calls quiet and peaceable lives.
Right.
And he attaches that to our evangelistic purpose in 1 Timothy 2.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Well said and absolutely right, absolutely biblical. So, dear listeners, almost all of whom are conservative like we are, please bear in mind, you are not being conservative when you take a revolutionary approach. Christians are not political revolutionaries. We are spiritual revolutionaries, to be sure, but not political. When you cheer on or when you hope for the coming civil war, that you hear a lot of people talking about, and even Christian people, hey, there's this war coming, as if, hey, let's just get it over with. It's inevitable. You know, you're not just looking to own the libs, but rather beat down the libs, you know, the liberals and the so-called deep state. When you do that, you're not prioritizing the mission, but you're being distracted by something else. I reminded our congregation a couple of Sundays ago that the Apostle Paul said in Romans 13, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. So you say, but, you know, Paul didn't have Biden as president. Well, you know, Paul would have been actually quite happy with Biden as president compared to what he had.
At least a step up.
from crazy Nero, the emperor at the time. So you don't like Biden. I get it. I don't either. But Biden or Trump or Hillary or in the future, whether it's Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, or whomever, those are not my priority. They shouldn't be, as Christians, your priority either. And we cannot allow them to distract us, or as well cannot allow our commitment to a political cause to move us to align ourselves with unsavory people and tactics. Because if it's win at all cost, and there's such a focus upon the political arena that we can't let them take control, and if they do, then we need to do everything we can to smear them, to to get them out of office. And when our people are in, we got to do everything we can to defend them and overlook their foibles and lies and problems. David French, who we've mentioned a few times, he's a Christian, evangelical Christian. He's also a trained lawyer. He's also an Iraq War veteran as well, and he writes for something called The Dispatch, which I recommend you subscribe to. But he wrote this week something that's consistent with my observations and experience of evangelicals when he said this: I'm old enough to remember the words and expressed beliefs of even some of the most enthusiastic Trumpist evangelicals before they supported Trump. And this much I know, he said. If I'd told them in December of 2014 that white evangelicals would shortly vote in overwhelming numbers for a thrice married man who bragged about grabbing women by their genitals, appeared in a Playboy movie, paid hush money to cover up an affair with a porn star, and was facing multiple corroborated claims of sexual harassment and sexual assault, they'd say it's only the Democrats who are that hypocritical. If I capped off my prediction, my prophecy, by noting that white evangelicals would be far more likely than virtually any other American community to embrace wild election conspiracy theories, And then a subset of that community would literally storm the Capitol with prayers on their lips. Then they think I'd simply lost my mind.
Mm-hmm.
But that is where we are, he says.
As you read that quote,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm hearing myself and my friends talking about in the 90s character matters and criticizing people who go around after an election saying, not my president.
Yes, exactly. If you don't like the one in office, then you say he's not my president, right? Yeah, exactly. Clinton in the 90s, Clinton had all of his sexual escapades and was accused credibly of assault and all of that. In 2016, then candidate Trump could not have had a better candidate to run against with all of his baggage, because when that was brought up, it was negated by the fact that Hillary Clinton had, she had gone to bat for her husband, and he could use that against her. And as a matter of fact, if you remember, at one of the debates, the 3 presidential debates they had, at one of them, Trump had Clinton's accusers sitting on the front row.
I didn't know that.
He
no.
brought the accusers and sat them on the front row, all to blunt the criticism toward him, which it successfully did. But, now it's, okay, in the 90s, Bill Clinton is a rogue, and we decry him for his lack of character, but now it's our rogue. And so now what do we do with it? Well, apparently what many do with it is they cover for it, or they don't say anything about it. So friends, what we need to do is we need to pray for our government, and pray not that there's going to be a civil war, that it's going to be torn down, but rather that its institutions will work as intended. Pray that we put people of character in office in the years ahead, people who care about maintaining and strengthening those institutions, not tearing them down, people who put the interests of the country before their own.
Amen. Well, so that is a fitting cap to this past year and why it matters to us as Christians. Caring about the preservation of the order in our country so that we can carry out the focus on the mission and being people of truth who have credibility when we share the message. So we hope this discussion has been as helpful to you as it has been to us. And I remind you again that if you don't already, you should subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell so you know when our new episodes come out. We try to publish those every Saturday at 2. We'll be off for the next 2 weeks, but we'll see you at the first episode in January as we recap 2021 and the issues we talked about related to religion and doctrine. So thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. If you have a question you'd like us to consider, you can send that in to our email address, info@cbctrenton.com, or text it to us at 97000.